Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new webinar, and we've been super happy to see you all. On behalf of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, we are giving you a very warm welcome. Today we have a very exciting lineup, and the topic will be taxation for redistributive justice solutions for women, the people, and the planet. And this webinar specifically has been organized alongside the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And we are just very thrilled to have you all, and we are waiting for some exciting discussion and comments. So we just really wanted to welcome you all. I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm the co-convener of the Women's Working Group on FFD. I'm working on a feminist Mexican organization called Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo, Familia. So I just wanted to say hi, and I'm going to give the floor now to my colleague Rosa Lizarre, who's also the co-convener of the Women's Working Group on FFD.
Gracias, Emilia. Thank you. Bienvenidas. Welcome to all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Rosa Lizarre, as Emilia has said. I'm the Global Director of the Feminist Task Force and a co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. So I just want to give you a little background about the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. We were founded in 2006 as an alliance of women's organizations and networks which advocate for the advancement of gender equality, women's rights, in the context of the financing for development related processes at the UN. And part of our work has been to demystify the financing for development agenda and bring analysis through advocacy, and begin to dismantle the inequalities that promote policies and programs that dismantle inequalities, that promote policies and programs that advance women's economic justice. So the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development has provided a lot of guidance throughout the years. In 2008, in the lead up to the Doha Review Conference, which was the second global conference on financing for development, and in the context of the financial crisis at that time, those UN processes presented opportunities to make significant structural changes in the global development architecture. And the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development seized this political moment to move towards advocating for a rights-based global development architecture that recognized the central role of the care economy, social reproduction, and sexuality. In 2015, the Advocacy and Strategizing for the third Financing for Development Conference in Addis Ababa provided an extensive arena for alliance building, networking, and strategizing on financing for development related issues, bringing a feminist and women's rights perspective to the discussions and the deliberations of the Addis Ababa Conference. And certainly now in 2020, in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, the global uprising in defense of racial tensions, xenophobia, and sexism, there is a need for continued vigilance, interpretation, and analysis to a changing world. Our intention is to bring this forth with partners, bring this analysis, thinking, dialogue, discussion, and key messaging and action. So these webinars are part of this work, and we're thrilled to be working with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and the Tax and Gender Working Group. So without further delay, let me introduce our moderator and our partner in organizing this webinar. Caroline Otim is the Global Campaigns and Policy Coordinator for Africa for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. She specializes in gender analysis and is committed to harnessing the power of policy and advocacy for movement building and collective mobilization to make governments more effective and accountable to citizens and to ensure that tax justice is a lived reality for all. So, Caroline, welcome. Take it away. And we can't hear you, so you'll need to unmute.
Sorry, I was speaking while on mute. Thank you so much, Emilia and Rosa, for that introduction. As Rosa has said, I'm from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which is a growing movement of tax justice. And we comprise of 5 regional networks. from Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and the Latin America. And collectively, the Global Alliance represents hundreds of organizations that include civil society organizations, trade unions, economic researchers, as well as women's rights organizations. And together, we take collective action for greater transparency, democratic oversight, and the redistribution of wealth in national and also at the global tax level systems. So GATJ has working groups, and one of them is the Tax and Gender Working Group that has graciously co-organized this webinar together with the Women's Working Group on FFD. And the working group basically provides a space for members of the GATJ regions to engage directly in the campaign and policy work on tax and gender issues, and also to strengthen the global integration of tax justice organizations, as well as women's rights organizations. And with that background, and as my colleague Emilia has said, this particular webinar is part of a series that is being put together by the Women's Working Group on FFD. It's an action-oriented dialogue on macro issues and basically macro solutions for women, the people, and the planet. And so for this session, I will be your moderator, and we would really love this session to be as interactive as possible. We want to hear from you, and we are also going to hear from our stellar lineup of speakers, and of course our respondent, and then we'll be able to open up the floor for a Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions or you have comments, please be able to make use of the comment section on the YouTube link that this session is being live streamed to. Please drop your comments there or your questions. We have a powerful team, a tech team who will be able to collect all your questions, and we shall have our panel respond to all of them. As a brief background to this webinar, most of the time, women's voices really go unheard in the policy debates dominated by global capital, and even as national governments corporate demands for tax incentives, subsidies, as well as reduction in corporate tax, and also ignore our demands that corporations and the wealthy need to pay their fair share of taxes, the needs of marginalized women and vulnerable groups experiencing intersecting discriminations, and the planet, and all those concerned with the well-being of human societies are increasingly being neglected. And the growing income inequality between the global north and the global south is a concern. And we really need to act because this has reached crisis levels. And the COVID-19 pandemic is really exacerbating these challenges. And therefore, in light of this, we are going to hear from our panelists, and they speak from different perspectives on this topic. And therefore, we are going to start with Veronica Serafini. And Veronica Serafini is a researcher, and she's a feminist economist from Paraguay, based at Latindad. Latindad is a network composed of 23 institutions and campaigns in 12 countries, working to resolve problems arising from the systemic crisis. And more recently, together with partners at Eurodad, Veronica has written about the impact of COVID-19 in Latin America. So Veronica, we would like you to really share with us how the international financial architecture continues to entrench illicit financial flows and tax dodging, which subverts the tax and fiscal justice, and how it is linked to the global dimension of the COVID-19 crisis. Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Caroline. I am very happy to be here today. And, well, I began, I have slides. Thank you. The full exercise of human rights by women and the reduction of the gaps of separate them from men put the state at the center of the debate on the mechanism for achieving these objectives. To make this right effective, public policies are required, which entails financing them. In this case, fiscal policy is the main instrument. The finance of expenditure has as its counterpart the collection of taxes as a genuine mechanism for obtaining income. The tax system is not gender neutral. A low tax burden and the lack of efficient mechanisms to reduce evasion and avoidance reduce revenues and cause shortage in public resources. Latin America has large social debts and deficit in ensuring economic, social, and cultural rights, situation that was exacerbated with the arrival of COVID-19 and particularly for women. Two of the problems affecting women have shown a sharp worsening with the pandemic: work overload and domestic violence. Both derived from the quarantine strategy. The next slide, please. Thanks. The situation is aggravated because a significant proportion of women work without remuneration at their homes or are working in precarious conditions, affecting their economic autonomy. Most of the measures taken by countries to help maintain households during the quarantine benefits formal workers, in which women are underrepresented. These measures were channeled through social protection systems. Given the institutional design of social protections system in Latin America that focus on formal work, the coverage in almost all countries is low and exclude women in particular. Due to the low and inequitable tax pressure, Latin American states collect little, so they cannot offer service with broad coverage and quality either in normal or pandemic times. Gender-based violence and overload of domestic and care work added to the precarious working conditions, wage discrimination, occupational segregation, and lower asset endowments require greater investment in all policies. Without tax revenues, the financing of public policies forces countries into debt. Evidence shows that the consequence of debt problems affects women in particular. The structural adjustment programs implemented in the 80s and recently the austerity policies had different types of impact by sex and contributed to deepening gender inequalities. The system tax have a gender bias. A tax system sustained by indirect taxes deepens gender inequality, especially in case of lower income women. The lower resources available, given the weight of indirect tax on low family income, require more effort and time to optimize the intra-family allocation. This situation especially affects low-income women and female-headed households. A fair tax structure based on direct taxes has great redistributive potential. However, the redistributive capacity and its power to reduce gaps can be reduced if the structure of deductions and exemptions has certain bias. In general, tax deductions favor high-income sectors and corporations, where women are underrepresented. The high tax expenditures shown by the region do not ensure a positive net balance for women. In other words, we don't know if the tax laws have benefits in job generation, technology transfer, the inclusion of micro and small business in productive change, among other expected objectives of the incentive policies. What is known is that many of corporations that benefit from tax deductions also benefit because they pay lower salaries to women compared to men. Illicit financial flows are another way of reducing revenue, but in some cases, they also have direct negative effects on women, as in the case of human trafficking or the expansion of soy or mining that affects their living environments. Thus, tax policy, instead of becoming an instrument for the development and well-being of life of the population and of women in particular, contributes to the persistence of inequality, including gender inequalities. Next slide, please. Capital flight results in the loss of resources needed to finance public policies that are necessary for women. Offshore institutions are concentrated in developing countries and become fiscal and financial havens by ensuring banking secrecy and opacity. In this context, tax evasion and avoidance by capital and corporations become one of the main causes of low and inequitable tax revenues in developing countries, reducing the fiscal space needed to finance development. Developing countries recover this capital through debt or tax incentives that attract foreign direct investment, both which have different effects by sex and have the potential deepen inequalities. In this context, in which the developing countries in their citizens losing out, international institutions on financial and tax rules and standards are dominated by the world's richest countries. Multilateralism and democracy are losing relevance as decision-making mechanisms affecting all countries in the world. The response provided by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which bring together the 36 richest countries in the world, is the inclusive framework on BEPS. The base erosion is, sorry, the next slide. The inclusive framework on BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting framework, refer to tax planning strategies used by multinational enterprises that exploit gaps and mismatch in tax rules to avoid paying taxes. The BEPS include 15 actions, but are insufficient for emerging and less developed countries, as they have a bias that benefits the richest countries. The last slide, please. Thank you. Since international tax institutions do not contribute to reducing inequalities between and within countries, including gender inequalities, civil society organizations involved in the debate on financing for development demand, among other actions. 5 actions. 1, incorporate the women's movement into the decision-making process. 2, tax body to democratize the global decision of tax. 3, unitary tax to multinational corporations according to the real economic substance of where they actually do business to finance policies that benefit women and close the gaps. 4, cooperate in the implementations of BEPS. 5, a progressive tax system in Latin America countries because it's the most unequal region of the world, including wealth tax. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for that wonderful presentation and for sharing with us how tax impacts on gender equality and the fact that women need a new global financial architecture that is responsive to gender equality, and for pointing out on the last note on progressive taxation as a means out of the current state of inequality that we are a part of. And that not only is it that inequality is in unsustainable levels in Latin America, but that is the same story across the global south. It is something that as women's organizations, we keep demanding that things need to change. And this is a perfect time to do so. And so for our next speaker, Leah Erenyu. Leah Erenyu is research, advocacy, and movement building manager at Akina Mama wa Africa. She has a keen interest in the intersection of economic exploitation and gender oppression. Her work looks at economic governance, focusing on tax justice, corporate accountability, and decent work for women, particularly those in the global value chains in the horticultural sector. And so Leah will be able to give us Africa perspectives in the global conversation. She'll also focus on the Becky panel report on illicit financial flows, which of course is as a result of flawed global financial systems that operates in an environment characterized by high level of opacity and lack of a clear global regulation. And we see IFFs really making Africa a net contributor to the world. And therefore, we really need to highlight all these issues. And what does this really mean for redistributive justice? So Leah will be able to take us through this, and she'll also be able to share with us examples coming from the Africa region. And at this point, I'd like to point out that if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please drop them in the comments section on the YouTube link that you're viewing from. We welcome your questions, we welcome your comments, and we'll be able to get back to them at the tail end of this session during the Q&A. Leah, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to everybody for allowing me to participate on this panel. It's a great honor. I work with an organization called Akina Mama wa Africa. We are based in Kampala, Uganda, and we are a Pan-African feminist leadership development organization. And we're really happy to contribute to this conversation on tax justice and women's economic justice in general. So I must start my presentation today with the story of the Congo. Perhaps there is no piece of literature that has influenced the public imagination about the helplessness, the savagery, the barbarism of Africa than Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. He basically painted a picture of a continent or of a country of people without agency and with land that was rich and ready for the taking. And the story of the plunder of the Congo really begins or really takes off with King Leopold, renaming the country, the Belgian Congo, and looking at it as his own property and exploiting that land and killing the people from that land in the millions. I would really like to paint a very different picture of Africa and the exploitation that Africa has undergone, and yet I must again start with the story of the Congo. So about 2 weeks ago, UN experts shared a report to the UN Security Council about a vast network of smuggling of gold out of Eastern Congo. That has been a place of conflict since the 90s. And that is a place where neighboring countries, corporations, individuals have basically made a killing. If you look at gold exports coming out of Uganda, so Uganda barely mines any gold, but Uganda has gold as its top foreign exchange earner and its top foreign export. And reports have said that 95% of gold from Uganda is actually not from Uganda, and it's mostly from the Congo. Uganda in 2018 exported about $514 million worth of gold. So then the question is, if Uganda is not mining gold, where is that gold coming from that the refinery in Uganda is exporting? So the report by the UN experts said that about 1.8 million US dollars was lost in just one small area of the Congo. And but reports estimate that about 300 to 600 million US dollars worth of gold is actually exported, or rather smuggled out of the Congo every year. So the story of mineral-rich Congo is the story of much of Africa, rich in resources, but poor in every human development indicator. But the story of gold is a small chapter in a large story of plunder. If it's not gold, then it's coltan, titanium, elephant tusks, pangolin scales, and all these are things that are actually coming out of Africa. The story of the Congo is the story of the continued exploitation of the African continent along colonial lines, empowering cities that are in the global north. The implication is basically that whatever is on the continent that can be moved will be moved. Whatever can be sold will be sold. If it cannot be moved, then someone will move to Africa and exploit it, but will not leave the resources there, but instead export it back to their home countries. So it's a story of exploitation, but not for the benefit of the people on the ground, but for the benefit of a lot of communities and economies in the global north. And that is really the story of IFFs. And that is just a microcosm of it. That is really IFFs coming out of criminal activities, coming out of smuggling. But the biggest story of IFFs is one, and by IFFs I'm talking about illicit financial flows, is the story of tax evasion, tax avoidance by high net worth individuals, but largely by corporations. And this is basically what the Mbeki High Level Report said, that the continent loses about $50 billion in lost resources due to commercial activities, due to criminal activities, and also due to corruption. But you see, the thing is, the story of Africa is also quintessentially the story of corruption. But if you look at the figures of resources that are lost to corruption, they pale in comparison to the resources that are actually lost through commercial activities, which is mostly tax evasion and tax avoidance. All the corporations that are coming to Africa and setting up shop are getting into double taxation agreements. They're trying to reduce their tax liabilities as much as possible. And we also have a system that basically enables that to happen. Because African countries are largely perceived to be poor, all of them are fighting to attract all these foreign direct investment, of course, with the support of the World Bank, which publishes all these guidelines about the ease of doing business. And if you have low corporate tax, then that becomes a great area for doing business. So you have all these African countries trying to lower their tax rates as much as possible in order to attract foreign direct investment. But of course, we've seen that does not ultimately translate into better well-being or economic growth for people. And we've also seen that these very same corporations then collude with state officials to set up companies. And this is also goes hand in glove with those very opaque financial systems that Veronica talked about and that Caroline talked about as well. This continued exploitation is very much along colonial lines. And there is a paradox that has also come up. So if people are familiar with the story of Isabel Dos Santos, this is the a daughter of the former president of Angola, who basically stole quite a bit of money from Angola and cleaned it up and transported it across 41 countries. She had business across 41 countries, and it had this veneer of respectability. Of course, when I talk about the Congo and I talk about criminals and I talk about people fueling war using minerals, it is very easy and quite easy to point out and say that that is criminality. And then when I contrast it with Isabel Dos Santos, who's in a nice suit, who's going to all these banks in the global north, and they're the ones who are basically cleaning up her money, then the air of respectability makes us look elsewhere. And it's so interesting that the investigation actually showed that most of the countries where Isabel Dos Santos had her businesses are the ones that had really strong laws on transparency and really strong laws around money laundering, and yet her businesses were still successful there. So that just shows you how difficult it is to track illicit financial flows. And then when we're talking about illicit financial flows, that conversation is inextricably linked to the conversation on debt, because Africa is practically drowning in debt. There is a debt to GDP ratio of 59% that has now been worsened by the coronavirus. And why is it that our governments are borrowing? You know, you borrow when you think that you don't have, or you borrow if you don't have at all, or you also borrow if it's just really easy to borrow. It's kind of like very simple money or very easy to acquire money. And now that has actually put us in a trap. But that's because a lot of our resources are actually leaving the continent and are not being utilized by us. And then we're saying we do not have money to be able to finance all these goals that we have, and therefore we should borrow. And now we are in a terrible crisis, and we cannot even fund our health systems. We cannot fund social protection. If I'm looking at the budget in Uganda for the financial year 2020-2021, actually debt servicing is the number 3 item on the budget after security. So that tells you that is quite problematic. And you have education and health coming long after. So it means that those items, as Veronica mentioned, will not be prioritized. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna jump to maybe how we can start thinking about solutions and redistribution. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that we do not have this information about Africa as a net creditor? So the thing about power is that it's very exclusionary. It controls and it also excludes people from having knowledge about certain things. So a lot of people don't know this, so it's not even a key demand that they will make, and it's to the benefit of a certain people that Africans do not know, have this idea of their potential sovereignty and their agency. So consciousness raising is one of the most important things in a movement building toolkit, of course. So we need to make people aware of what is happening, because when they're aware, then they'll be able to demand for an end to these kinds of practices. But beyond that, we need the global north to take responsibility for their contribution to Africa's chaos in development. I feel that the moment has arrived for people to analyze their oppressive systems and to do a power analysis. I feel that right now there's that global conversation around reparations, around self-reflection, and people analyzing how they're misusing their power. I think that's a conversation that the global north has to have, and to see what they have to do to repair the damage that they have done. But this does not mean that African governments are not culpable, because they are the ones, to an extent, that also allow these people to come and continue the same abusive business practices. But in order to keep, to make sure that African governments are held accountable, it means that the population, the citizens have to understand what is going on. For me, I see the project of curbing illicit financial flows as a decolonization project. On the one hand, you're educating people and telling them that we have all these vast resources. We're actually not poor. It's these people that are actually coming and exploiting and taking everything away. And then you rouse up the crowd, you get everybody excited, and then they demand and they tell the government that we actually have all the resources to fund all these health systems and all these things that you continually say you do not have money for. What you need to do is to demand for accountability from all these corporations that you're practically in bed with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was a very catchy presentation, excellently presented and shared with us. Clearly, you have given us the history of what colonialism has done to Africa, the economic systems of oppression through decades of structural adjustments programs, and this was also emphasized by Veronica in her earlier presentation. These continue to minimize the welfare of the state and thereby reducing the involvement of the state in socioeconomic programs. And we see this really being perpetuated through illicit financial flows with very staggering figures, particularly from the Africa region. And you have really painted that picture for us, Leah. And so it's important that even as we continue making demands, that we demand that taxes really work for women. And that is one hashtag that the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the Working Group on Tax and Gender, continues to use, that make taxes work for women. Because the money lost through illicit financial flows can really go a long way to fund public services that at the end of the day would really benefit women and other vulnerable groups in the society. And so to continue this conversation and to also add to what Leah and Veronica have presented to us, we are going to have Tao also make a presentation. Tao is the Executive Director of Action Aid Vietnam. They focus on working with marginalized groups to build a better life. Their programs are to address the issues of poverty and injustice, where economic empowerment plays an important role to change the power balance. Action Aid Vietnam is also a co-convener of the Global Alliance Asia chapter, that is TAFJA. TAFJA is the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, and they contribute resources for capacity building and research initiatives on tax justice in the region. So Tao has a wealth of experience, and she's going to really share with us the impact of the crisis, the current COVID-19 crisis on women, people, and planet. And she'll also get to highlight some of the gendered impacts and what is the cost of redistributive expenditure policies around the globe to finance both public services, climate change, and other environmental initiatives. And she'll be able to also share with us examples from the Asia Pacific region. I'm seeing questions are coming in through the comment box. Please keep your questions coming in. We are taking note of them, and we are going to share them with our panelists for them to share with us their perspectives on your questions. Thank you, Tao. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Caroline. I think it's really difficult for me to speak after two so eloquent speakers with a lot of information. And that the expectation of the speech it's quite high, but at the same time I'm trying to be bringing to you the finding the research and the evidence from the response that Vietnam government is making to ensure that until now nobody from Vietnam died from coronavirus. What is the magic about it? And at the same time, the situation of migrant women workers in our textile sector. and how it links to tax. So I'm trying to rephrase uh, the expectation of the speech so that you don't get so shocked, because I'm trying not to be so macro, and I hope it's useful for your time here. I would like to thank Gajay and Dafja for giving me this opportunity to join with you, and I would like to ask for your permission to be stopping the camera, because the link and the connection might be better in that way. Thank you. Right, so as you may know, Vietnam so far has joined a lot of free trade agreements, and as our government always say, we are very powerful in terms of free trade agreements. We joined so far 22 free trade agreements with so many different regions and country. And last 2 weeks ago, the National Assembly, which is the Congress in our case, has approved the effectiveness of recently signed Vietnam EU FTA with the effective dates from the 1st of August. And we are the very first developing country having such kind of agreement with EU. I'm trying to say that in terms of the tax system, Vietnam is highly open to offer very favorable conditions to the foreign direct investment, the corporates, so that in the name of trade, the resources for public investment has been flying out of the country. So in the past two presentations, you have a lot of information around how tax has been benefiting the corporates much more than people. But I would like to bring your attention to the case of the textile and garment industry in Vietnam. Maybe you know that Vietnam is giving 4% of total textile and garment products all over the world. That might be not so big in terms of number of the total year, but it produced half of the whole country export in the past few years, and it produced jobs for 20+% of our whole labor force, which means almost 3 million people are relying on textile and garment industries. But due to a lot of commitment that the government has done through different free trade agreements, the tax for different components of textile and garment industries in Vietnam are ranging from 0% to 5%, which is really, really low. It was the communication from the government that, okay, this is hope that more foreign investment would come to the country and more jobs will be created. But if you unpack it, you see that 80% of these 3.6 million workers in garment and textile industries are women, and 90% of them are migrant women workers who actually left their villages to come to live in very difficult conditions. I can't say slum, but very difficult condition, living compound and work hours and hours in the factories. In our recent research across different factories in 10,000 women workers, it is quite alarming that more than 87% of the women I confirm that they have been sexually harassed in those factories. and almost 70% of them decided not to say anything because whether they will be losing job or they know that if they say, then nothing will happen anyway. um, and we are saying that the at the same time the government saying that okay, more foreign direct investment should come, and we are trying to to join the race to the bottom, so that our tax will be much more attractive to other countries. But it doesn't mean that the investment from tax will go to technology or in innovation. It only comes to the pockets of the corporate owners. Secondly, how tax will impact our people and planet. Uh, through the first two presentations, you see it very clearly that the tax is the most powerful tool for redistribution of wealth and opportunity. But we have to be very clear with us that the consumerism is actually the very first key reason why we come to this stage, why our environment has been destroyed, why our people life have been destroyed. So the tax actually across all the ASEAN country and some of the Pacific country actually are very much encouraging consumerism through different kind of funding, through different kind of VAT rate, and very limited options for the green solutions to consumer consumptions. Most importantly, due to the tax commitments in different agreements, we don't need to list here whether it's regional or national or international agreements. Tax are compromised, and therefore public services are compromised or ignored or defunded. Unpaid care work and access by women to quality public services are actually ignored. I would like to mention to you, maybe you already heard the information that up to now there's nobody died in Vietnam due to COVID-19 virus, and that actually thanks to the consistent investment by the government to the public healthcare system, to the prevention options, not necessarily the treatment, but the prevention option in the past 10 years in the public services system. So that's why when we respond to the pandemic, it is much easier to control the virus. And I believe the government is still committing so much in that. But I believe that we are lucky because the investment is in such kind of public services. If it's not, then we can look clearly to other cases where lots and lots of people die or infected without treatment. Um, so I would like to say that the time is not um, the time is not very much in my side, and English is not my first foreign language. But I would like to call for your attention to the public actions on how we can turn around the situation. So yes, you know, proposing solutions or options for current system is important. But it's also important to ensure that the tax tool that we are advocating for actually, one, reducing the consumerism, and two, ensure that the public investment in public services and system will serve for the benefits of women, because gender responsive public services will make it more impactful and effective for long-term sustainability. In our research around unpaid care work in Vietnam in the last 6 years, over 8,000 people, it showed clearly that wherever the public services are available, whether it's about the water, school, clinics, number of hours that women spend on unpaid care work is so much lower. So in some areas, women spend 9 hours a day to spend on unpaid care because they have to go very far to take water. They have to go very far to fetch their children from school or so. But in some areas where women only spend 15 minutes on unpaid care work because of the level of awareness, because of the availability of the services, and the availability of machine and facilities. So I'm trying to say that the public services need investment, and that actually come from the tax tools. So I hope that in our next discussion, when we call for public services, it's important to use tax tool to reduce consumerism, but at the same time investing in public services. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Tao, for that presentation and for highlighting for us how important tax is for redistributive justice, highlighting the gendered impact of taxation on women, and also sharing with us the differentiated impacts of COVID on the current in the current situation. And also, importantly, I'm seeing that time is really running out, and I would want to welcome Kate Donald as a respondent to the presentations that we have had to sort of summarize and to highlight any outstanding issue, to highlight our key demands and messaging for taxation for redistributive justice. Kate is the Director of Program at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, where she focuses primarily on issues of economic policy and inequalities. Kate, the floor is yours now.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, everyone. Really great insights from everyone, from all the other speakers. So I'm going to try and be quick because I want to make sure there's lots of time to respond to the good questions that are coming in the chat box. So I just wanted to kind of build off the presentations to kind of sum up what I think are 4 of the key points to emphasize. So number 1 is that it's just to really emphasize this fact that taxes themselves, not just fiscal policy overall, are really, really important for gender equality. Sometimes I have people say to me, well, of course, I understand why public spending is important for gender equality because you need to spend on public services, but I still really don't get why taxes are important. And I think this is really important to understand, so I want to emphasize it because, I mean, so for example, Alex Cobham of Tax Justice Network developed this really nice kind of 4 R's framework about taxation, where he says that, taxation is about revenue raising, redistribution, repricing, and representation. So for example, of course, taxes are important for gender equality because they raise the money that you then need to spend on the public services and the social services, for example, that are so important to achieve gender equality. But tax also helps redistribute power and resources in the first place. And you have the example of some countries, for example, Brazil is an example I often cite, where even when Brazil had very progressive social programs that I'm talking about before the current administration, but the way that the taxes were raised meant that actually most of the money to pay for those social programs was coming from the poorer sections of society, which totally undercuts the goal of redistribution. And the repricing element is important too, because as Veronica emphasized, taxes can incentivize or disincentivize certain behaviors. For example, they can incentivize women having decent work, or they can disincentivize women leaving the home to work. So it's really important to understand that taxes themselves are very, very important for creating an environment of gender equality and raising the money for gender equality. And also because, as Leah said, the lack of progressive taxation and the kind of continued outflow of money from global South countries through illicit financial flows leads to these huge debt burdens. And debt itself also has very negative ramifications on gender equality, as was highlighted in the Women's Working Group webinar a couple of weeks ago. So it's this vicious circle. The second point I wanted to make is around intersectionality, which I think was implicitly brought out in some of the presentations, but I wanted to really highlight it because, so we have this hashtag make taxes work for women, which is a good shorthand, but I would like to really emphasize that a feminist approach to tax policy also means making taxes work for other disadvantaged groups. It means making taxes work for Black people, for trans people, for Indigenous people, for people with disabilities, for migrants. And, really we want to use tax policy and fiscal policy to tackle all the systems of oppression that we're up against. Patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, neocolonialism as a really important one that Leah mentioned. Thirdly, I wanted just to take a minute to kind of highlight some of the concrete proposals that the speakers had made, which kind of course, revolve around the really urgent need to tackle illicit financial flows, especially from transnational corporations coming out of the global south, aided and abetted by the global north, in fact, facilitated by global north countries and their financial secrecy. But also some of the proposals that have come out in the COVID context or have been given renewed energy in the COVID context, like, for example, an excess profits tax on corporations, or implementing or boosting wealth taxes at the national, regional, and global level. And I think it's important to say that all of these proposals for progressive taxation would be in line with international human rights law. That's something that we've been working on at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, providing a human rights justification for these kind of proposals. And also one of the really important elements of these proposals that have been brought out by the speakers is the urgent need for a reform of the global financial architecture and global economic governance. Because unfortunately, we're now in a situation where many global south countries have very limited fiscal and policy space. So even if they wanted to implement more progressive taxation or tax corporations more highly, it's very, very difficult for them to do so because of the rules imposed on global north or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. I'm trying to avoid acronyms, for example. So this is an absolutely crucial part of the puzzle. We can't just be putting all the focus on national governments. We need to be looking at those macro global governance structures. And so I'm gonna sum up now so we have time for questions. But I just want to emphasize, like as Leah said, it's all about power. Tax is really a matter of power, and that's the way that we need to look at it. It's about power and it's about human rights. And so if we care about those things, then we need to care about taxes too. Thanks very much, everyone, and I look forward to the speakers being able to answer some of the questions.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Kate. I'll now jump straight to the questions that we have. I'll take the first 5 questions or 6 questions. The speakers will be able to respond, and then I'll take another set of 6 questions and the speakers will respond afterwards. So the first question: is there any feminist law project on taxation? Which countries have applied a gender perspective in their taxation legislation or are debating it? Question number 2, what could be some special provision to promote women in the high taxpayers group, particularly for creating ease of doing business? Question number 3 is about the Mbeki report, and Leah, perhaps you could take a note of this. And also, while speaking about the Mbeki report, please contrast between corporate tax flows versus corruption and other kinds of illicit financial flows. The other question is about, let me see. What are the key opportunities accompanied with foreign direct investments to create more jobs and ensure equality in employment and at decision-making level? The last question is, what can an individual state in the global north to stem IFFs from Africa? I'm thinking of UK, which is often identified as providing tax havens, money laundering, and China invests heavily in Africa. Were you able to get those sets of questions? If we can just have a fast round of the speakers responding to the questions, or do you want me to repeat them? We'll start perhaps with Leah and then Tao, then we'll finish off with Veronica and Kate, and then we'll do the next round.
Oh, all right. Sorry, I was not me. I was on mute. Okay, so I think the question was around just giving a bit more information on the Mbeki report, if I got you right.
Correct.
Okay, so part of the history of the Mbeki report comes on the heels of conversations around the financing for development agenda, because we had all these SDGs, and then the question was basically, how are we going to fund these SDGs? We cannot solely depend on donor funding. It means that we need to increase resource mobilization. But then it was also important to investigate the sources, the places where Africa was losing a lot of resources, because we seem to be doing a lot on the continent, but we can't seem to retain any resources to be able to fund our own development. So that's really the background for that. And the report estimated, it really emphasized the difficulty that befell it in terms of trying to estimate actual numbers. So the report says that about $50 billion leaves the continent, but it says that the numbers could actually be higher. Some people estimate that the numbers could be about $100 billion. And that's quite a lot of money. If you look at Africa's debt burden, I think it's over $300 billion now. And if you're thinking that you're losing about $100 billion every year, then that becomes a critical a leak that definitely needs to be plugged. And from the report also, it showed that corporate tax evasion was the main source of financial flows, and these were not necessarily through illegal activities. I talked about the veneer of respectability earlier. This is actually through legitimate agreements between states and corporations, or states with other states in the global north through double taxation agreements, which basically means that if Uganda signs a double taxation agreement with the Netherlands, then the bulk of the tax payment is happening in the Netherlands, to the detriment of Ugandans who are actually employed, who are offering their labor, who are also offering raw materials for the business that's actually happening in the country. So just very briefly, I will say that that's the background of the report. And then the other question was about what individual countries in the global north can do about the problem of illicit financial flows. I feel that I need to emphasize, in thinking about this problem, first of all, it's not an individual country problem. If you fix it within one country, it feels like that game Whack-A-Mole, where you kind of close a hole and then the mole emerges in another hole. So we can say that the UK will fix its financial regulatory problems. But then I'll simply go to the next country, and trust me, there are many countries that would like for corporations to come and house their headquarters there, or to do the bulk of their business activities there. So it means that this has to be a joint effort. I think one of the points of entry can be through regional blocks. So if we are looking at the global north, perhaps we can consider the European Union. What are some of the policies that the European Union is taking as a whole that all member states actually have to adhere to? And the same can be said for other things. But feminists and other activists have also been advocating for a global taxation body with the UN, with great resistance from the OECD. And I think that that is a demand that we actually need to hunker on and say that if we're talking about distribution of power and strengthening multilateralism, that is a body that we cannot do without. Because on the one hand, you have the OECD setting in place all these very tax policies that end up benefiting their membership. So you can't be the policeman, you can't be setting the regulations and then you also self-regulate. It just cannot work. So we need an independent tax body. So I think those are some of the demands that then citizens in the global north can make of their governments. Thank you.
Great. Kate, are you able to add any perspectives on that question as well, but also to consider this additional question in terms of, can you also foresee a role for monetary policies to increase the fiscal space for governments in the global south and to empower local stakeholders and improve gender impact for public investments?
Sure, I'm happy to come in, although I'm not going to tackle the monetary policy question because I'm afraid I'm definitely not a monetary policy expert. So, so maybe someone else, maybe someone else can tackle that one. The questions which I can come in on, if it's helpful, are so two of the questions I'm happy to answer. So around, for example, someone asked what global north governments can do. I mean, Leah has already covered some of that, but I think, it's really important to note that, global north governments speak in a very hypocritical way about tackling tax abuses and about tackling illicit financial flows. And at the same time that they present themselves as kind of champions of global development, champions of the SDGs, many of them are also facilitating the outflow of money from global south countries, meaning that those countries are going to find it very difficult to meet the SDGs or realize human rights. So, for example, Switzerland presents itself as a champion of the SDGs and of gender equality globally. But at the same time, its financial secrecy laws and its banks stash billions of dollars worth in illicit financial flows from global south countries, and the impacts that has on women, I think, has been clearly elucidated. So we need to get rid of tax havens. We need to get rid of financial secrecy laws. And in order to do that, global north countries need to take collective action, as Leah said, to actually put the money, put other people's money where their mouth is, as it might be, in order to stop those flows, because they really have a lot of power to do so. And I also wanted to, and the UK obviously is also, and everyone can hear I have a British accent, but I'm very critical of my own government in many regards. The UK is another classic example of that, because the UK presides over a number of tax havens, and also presents itself as a champion of global development at the same time. There was also another question about what countries have done to integrate a gender perspective in tax policy. I won't talk a lot about that, but just to flag, there was quite an interesting and progressive resolution from the European Parliament last year, which I can paste a link in the chat box. And there are some countries, for example, Spain has been having a kind of national dialogue and consultation around how it can make its tax policy more gender sensitive. So there are some positive examples out there, despite the kind of bleak picture that we often see, especially at the current moment.
Thank you, Kate and Leah, for those responses. Tao and Veronica, any question that you could respond to? Maybe we start with Tao, then we'll finish off with Veronica.
Thank you. I guess the question around how textile and garment can create jobs. I think there was a question around that, right? Sorry, right. The textile and garment have created more jobs for women. It's great. Actually, I get it's not so great, because the job in textile and garment sector in many countries, including Vietnam, are not so great for women. They have to work in shifts, long hours with very poor conditions. And in the presentation earlier, I have shared with you some of the key situations around sexual and violence harassment in those places. At the same time, the protection by the labor law to the workers are not necessarily strong. And when the government is so excited about commitment to the free trade agreements, there are further pressures to weaken the labor conditions for the women. So yeah, I need to say that a lot of job has been created, but are they decent job? We have to discuss more about. In terms of the tax policies to support this sector, I also mentioned briefly in the presentation that we actually ask for more tax incentives to the factories, the companies, the investors that first invest in cleaner technology, in new technologies. Second, the investor of factories or companies providing decent working condition for women workers, and third, to ensure that they have their own unions, and their rights to association will be respected. Maybe some of you are aware that so far in Vietnam we only have one trade union, and like Kate mentioned earlier, and we fully agree with, is that tax is a very powerful tool to incentivize or disincentivize certain kind of behaviors for the consumer and the corporates. Therefore, we believe that it is important for the government to make sure that the tax tool they provide to the free trade agreement investors would not impact negatively to the life of the millions of women who works in the textile and garment sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Tao. I think there are questions also relating to some of the resources and policies that presenters were able to make reference to in their presentations. Liz, I see you've made a comment about the UN Security Council report. I think we should be able to share that link or any other relevant link to that particular report. There's also a question around the link to the research in Vietnam on sexual harassment in textile factories. So we should be able to pull out that link and share with you. There's also a question about the link to the 4 R's of taxation framework on revenue, redistribution, representation, and repricing. That is also available. We should be able to share with the participants who asked this, who asked for these resources. The other question that has come, the other set of questions that I'm going to ask our panelists, and this is the last round, then I'll have them respond briefly. The first question is, if IFFs are so evident, how can governments negotiate agreements that do not benefit their countries? It seems like they are unable to make good deals, in quotes. The second question, so maybe you respond to that, because I see that is the only question that I have on my end. So maybe speakers, you respond in terms of, do our governments have the capacity to negotiate in some of these spaces? Who will go first?
I can go.
Great, Leah.
So, and I think one of the things that makes tackling IFFs so much harder is the fact that there isn't as much expert knowledge on it. I remember the Pan-African Conference on Illicit Financial Flows in Nairobi last year, which is a thought leadership space, a strategy space for actors working on the issue of illicit financial flows. It was revealed that, first of all, it's when we go to the negotiating table, you're negotiating with a country that has, a group of lawyers, very well paid. You have economists, you have people that are specialized. And then let's say Uganda, you're sending one representative from the Ministry of Finance, who, first of all, does not even have such a strong grasp on financial flows or just bilateral negotiations, that sort of thing. So it is quite clear that there is a power imbalance. And I know that countries and foreign embassies exist to to protect the business interests of their countries. And that's exactly why we need to have some kinds of principles when we're doing these kinds of negotiations, understanding that power imbalance and making sure that there's certain principles that are at play so that there is fairness. Just because the other person is weaker does not then mean that you should take advantage of them. But also, one of the things that I remember activists proposed at that time was that since we are facing, this is a David versus Goliath sort of situation, there has to be Pan-African solidarity so that Africans are going to the negotiating table as a bloc. And you're not going as a country whose GDP, honestly, is the budget, I don't know, maybe the health budget of one country. There is no way you will ever negotiate fairly. So the scales are not balanced in our favor. So it means that we need critical mass. As we're going to the OECD, we need critical mass in whatever negotiations, because of course, the governments are not going to be benevolent and say, oh, you know, they're poor and they don't have as much expertise, and so let's be easy on them. Because the ultimate goal is profit making, there is nothing charitable about profit making. So I think that the governments may not necessarily do anything, but us on this side, we definitely have to, we need to come together as we are going to the negotiating table.
Thanks. I'll read the last two questions and then I'll give you 1 minute each for your closing remarks. Veronica, you'll also get an opportunity to respond to some of the issues that perhaps you had noted. So the last two questions for my panelists are, how can we incorporate women's and gender issues in the taxation of e-commerce? So the key issue now is taxation of the digital economy. So how can we incorporate women's and gender issues in that? And the last question is, what are African countries doing to control labor exploitation and natural resources and environmental degradation? So maybe I have your last views, responses to the questions in 1 minute each. And Veronica, you'll have slightly more time. So you have 2 minutes and the rest have 1 minute each.
Thanks, Caroline. I would like to answer one question in particular. Is there any feminist law project on taxation in Latin America? Particularly, I don't know, but I think that it's very difficult that the women's movement proposed a new law for two reasons. In first place, this means less privilege for high-level groups or corporations, and it's very difficult to approve this new law. And the second place, the second problem is the opacity of tax systems in Latin America. We don't have access to the microdata, and then it's very difficult to propose a law. But there are women's movements that are making macro proposals. For example, less tax for products, female products, about menstruation, for example. This type of issues, but proposal of law, new laws, I think that there isn't in Latin America. In other countries, in other regions, I don't know. And other questions was who need to be in the debate. We need to incorporate, for example, religious and social organizations, parliamentarians, journalists. We need to work, join other type of people, not only women's, because this is a question for a new tax system, not for women and for other type of inequalities in the world, indigenous, different types of groups. And well, it's all. I would like. I am very happy to participate from LatinDat. LatinDat is part of the Tax Justice Network and the Global Alliance of Tax Justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you. So your last comments, Leah, Tao, and then we finish off with Kate in 1 minute each, please.
Should I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think my parting shot would really come from the presentation that Veronica made about the multilateral system, because I feel that that is something that is under threat. And a lot of the interventions and solutions and reforms that would like to see will get their legitimacy from the multilateral system. And that is a system that is now being hijacked by corporate interests. And of course, these corporations have all this money because of exactly what we've been describing. The fact that they're not paying their fair share of taxes means that they have a lot more in their war chest to wage whichever war they want and to set the agenda. So we need to keep demanding for independent bodies. We need to have those bodies and then work on the flaws within those systems. The UN has its own challenges, that are several pages long, but it is a system that has set the agenda on human rights, and we still need it. So I feel that it's a system that, to a great extent, also holds a lot of nations accountable. So as we are talking about taxation and we're thinking about an accountability mechanism, it means that we need multilateralism as well. Thank you.
Tao, would you come in at this point? Then
yes, thanks. Yeah, thank you. I feel that the action is so much needed now, and it can come from a different level, and it's very important to make sure that the mass understands about the importance of tax and understand about the role that they can play in turning around this powerful game that the corporate and the government are playing against the planet, the people, and the women at the moment. So I hope that more and more discussion and public debates about how tax can be better response to the need of the people, of the women, should be done. Last but not least, I think we can start from a very small actions, like we can see whether the budgets of our government is responding to the need of the gender, I would like to thank you very much for your work and your sharing today. I have the research on the sexual harassment in textile factories in Vietnam, and would be happy to share with anybody who leave the email of the webinar, as well as the recent research on Vietnam textile garment, the impact of COVID-19 and beyond, in case you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Hi, yeah, I'll be very quick. Just in response to the question about feminist law projects regarding taxation, I'd just like to highlight the work of Kathleen Leahy at Queen's University in Canada. Her work's definitely worth checking out in that respect. And also on the issue of taxation of e-commerce, I think that the question of how to tax the digital economy and e-commerce is kind of actually a broader question about how we tackle this issue of global rule setting on taxation, global economic governance, how we tax multinational corporations in general. And this is where the kind of issues that Leah and Veronica have brought up are so crucial around, we need to tackle the disproportionate power of multinational corporations and global north governments. And we need to challenge this idea that rules should be set in the kind of rich country club of the OECD. I mean, for example, the US has basically just blown up this years-long process that the OECD was going through around how to tax the digital economy, which in some ways may not be a bad thing because it was a fairly illegitimate process from many people's perspective. But it just shows the fact that one country can blow up that process because they don't like it. A global north country shows just how disproportionate the power balance is and how much we really need to democratize these conversations at the global level. So thanks, everyone. Great questions.
Thank you all. Thank you, our wonderful speakers, for those stellar presentations and all your wealth of knowledge you've shared with us. And also for participants, thank you for tuning in and for listening in to this conversation. Of course, we can be able to continue with the conversation offline, and we welcome you to the next series of webinars that are being put together by Women's Working Group on FFD. And so at this point, I would want to hand over the microphone or the floor to Rosa to help us wrap up the session. Rosa, take it over now.
Hi, and Emilia, if we can get Emilia in here as well.
Great.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Caroline, for really leading us through this great discussion. Leah, Kate, Tao, Veronica, thank you so much. These were wonderful contributions. They feed in completely into our next phase of work. And so we're so happy to be partners in this with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and the Tax and Gender Working Group. So both Emilia and I have some news to share. And Emilia, why don't you kick off and I'll follow.
Well, I just wanted to first congratulate our amazing panel, and we've received very, very positive input so far from the audience. We just want to share that we are extremely happy because of some news that were out to the world today. So, Rosa, you want me to say it? I'm just so happy to, I could just really dance now. You know how this process on Beijing Plus 25 that was initiated by UN Women, and there was this section on the process that referred to the Generation Equality Forum, but there was this other process referred to the action coalitions on 6 specific topics, and there was one on economic justice and rights, and the Women's Working Group applied to be one of those co-leads for these coalitions, and you can see on your screen how these action coalitions are going to be having different actors such as member states, UN agencies, private sector, and also multilateral entities. And we are very happy to announce that the Women's Working Group for FFD is now one of the co-leads of the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. And we are super happy. We know that I think 1,600 organizations applied from all around the world to be part of one of the co-leads of the different action coalitions, and we are joined by 5 colleagues that from civil society and feminist organizations that will be joining us in the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, and we look forward to that. So we are. This was just, the news were just launched an hour ago, and we're very happy with you. Yes. Yeah,
actually the news we received last night that it was going to be announced live this morning at 9. And I think that there's been some social media, but there was also like the dysfunctional link from for the announcement, but I think the news now is out. And so we're really happy because as a coalition, we really look to our members and you know, the work that we've been doing on this webinar series really feeds into the work of the action coalitions. As some of you mentioned today, and I'll just name our partners. The country partners are Sweden, South Africa, Spain, Germany, and Mexico. So we have great partners in terms of the government. The international organization is the OECD. So as Kate mentioned, and then Leah mentioned, and Veronica and Tao as well, there's work that we have to do even within this. Having to work in an action coalition means you work with governments, you work with UN entities and institutions. The UN agency is the UN Capital Development Fund, and the private sector, or in this case, the philanthropic organization, or the capitalist philanthropic, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So together with the other partners as co-leads, and together with you as the Women's Working Group members, we really have work to do to really further this. This is supposed to be an agenda for catalyzing collective action, sparking global and local conversations, drive public and private interest, and deliver concrete game-changing results. This is the work for like the next 5 years. So we're thrilled to announce it to you, and we're thrilled that you're part of this as well. So,
and just to add to that, we are very happy that this is a network to mobilize women's organizations and women and feminist organizations, because other co-leads are just one single organization. There are other networks. So we think that in the case of the economic justice agenda, it's very crucial to really have a collective voice with a collective build-up of priorities, of messaging. So we look forward to engaging with all of you in the next 5 years to try to do our best effort in really bringing an feminist approach to these agendas, and really to think about how feminist organizations engage with the private sector, with processes as challenging as the ones that we were discussing today in relation to global north and global south, and where is the money, and what are the legal and the formal dynamics. So we will go there with you, and this series of webinars we think that have been very useful in helping us shape a view, and it will continue to do that. So we are very grateful for having with all of you in your homes, sharing this conversation with us.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, partners, for this wonderful webinar.
Yes.
Thank you.
And cheers.
Salud. Bravo.